Hi, welcome back to the channel. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about a fascinating story that emerged from Crimea this week because I think it tells us a lot about how the war in Ukraine is evolving and perhaps more importantly, how it's now starting to affect everyday life across Russia. The authorities in Crimea have introduced restrictions on motorcycles, mopeds, scooters, and quad bikes between 8 p.m. and 6 a.m. Now, at first glance, that sounds completely ridiculous. Why would anybody ban motorcycles at night? Well, according to the authorities in Crimea, the sound of the engines can be mistaken for Ukrainian drones. And because anti drone teams are increasingly active during the night, they don't want anything creating confusion. One official even warned that anti drone units often react to the sound of engines and suggested that in extreme circumstances, a motorcycle rider could potentially be mistaken for a drone. Now, whether you agree with that or not, it isn't really the point. The point is that 4 years ago, nobody in Crimea was discussing whether a motorcycle sounded too much like a military drone. Today, it's a big topic of discussion. And that's because Ukraine has fundamentally changed the nature of this war. Now, before we go into all of the details on this, could I ask anybody that hasn't subscribed yet to please hit that subscriber button? Only takes you a second. It's not really a subscription, it doesn't cost you any money, but it does help me with the algorithm and also puts a smile on my face. When Russia launched its full-scale invasion in February 2022, most military analysts were focused on tanks, artillery, aircraft, and missiles. Few people at that stage were talking about drones. Today, drones have become one of the most defining features of the entire conflict. Ukraine has spent the last 4 years building one of the most advanced drone programs in the world. What started as a necessity has evolved into a major strategic weapon. These drones are now capable of travelling hundreds and in some cases more than 1,000 kilometres. They've been used against refineries, fuel depots, military airfields, logistics centres, ammunition storage facilities, and strategic bomber bases. And perhaps most importantly, they've forced Russia to defend an enormous amount of territory. Russia is the largest country in the world geographically. It has thousands of miles of pipelines, thousands of miles of railway lines, it's got major ports, it's got dozens of airports, hundreds of military installations, refineries, storage depots, power facilities, and industrial plants spread across a vast geographic area. Protecting every one of those assets simultaneously is virtually impossible. And that's exactly the challenge Ukraine is trying to create. Now let's go back to Crimea because this is where some of the consequences are becoming particularly visible. Over recent weeks, Crimea has experienced significant fuel shortages. Gasoline stations have reportedly run dry, queues have formed, authorities have introduced restrictions on purchases at those stations that still have fuel, and at one stage motorists were limited to 20 litres per vehicle per purchase. Now, if you just think about that for a moment, Russia is one of the world's largest oil producers. Energy exports generate enormous revenues for the country, billions of dollars. Yet people living in Russian-controlled territory are finding themselves dealing with fuel restrictions. The issue isn't that Russia has run out of fuel, the issue is refining capacity, transportation, and logistics. Ukraine has repeatedly targeted Russian refineries over the past couple of years. Some facilities have been temporarily shut down for periods, others have been forced to reduce production while repairs are carried out. And whilst any individual strike may not seem particularly significant, the cumulative effect is becoming increasingly noticeable. Less refining capacity means less fuel available. Less fuel available means tighter supplies. Tighter supplies create shortages, restrictions, and higher costs. And eventually, those problems begin appearing at the pumps. The Russian government has already introduced measures to prioritise domestic fuel supplies, including restrictions on exports. And that highlights something we've been discussing many times before on the channel. Economic warfare is rarely about a single decisive event. It's about creating continuous pressure. It's about forcing your opponent to spend more money, devote more resources, and solve more problems. And that's exactly what we're seeing in Russia. But fuel isn't the only area where the effects are becoming visible. Another area is transport. Drone alerts have become increasingly common across parts of Russia. Whenever there's a credible threat, airports can be temporarily closed, flights are delayed, aircraft are diverted, passengers are left waiting. We've seen periods where hundreds of flights have been disrupted in a couple of days. Now compare that with how most people think about airports. People expect delays because of weather or technical issues or occasionally air traffic control problems. You don't expect one because of a drone alert. Yet that's increasingly becoming part of daily reality in Russia. And there's a financial cost associated with this. Airlines lose money, airports are losing cash, passengers don't lose time, and obviously they're not spending at the airport if you're not going there, and businesses miss their meetings, supply chains become less efficient. But there's something else as well, because every disruption serves as a reminder that the conflict isn't as distant as once appeared. And that brings us to another important development: mobile internet restrictions. Authorities have increasingly restricted mobile data services during periods of heightened drone activity. The rationale is that limiting connectivity may make drone operations more difficult. Whether that is effective or not is a separate debate. The important point is that these restrictions affect everybody. Modern life depends on mobile connectivity. People using it for banking, navigation, payments, taxi services, food deliveries, messaging, work. So when access to the internet becomes unreliable or actually shuts down, daily routines become a lot more difficult. Again, we're not talking about catastrophic events here. We're talking about a series of inconveniences that gradually make life less predictable. And this is where I think the story becomes particularly interesting, because all of this raises a much bigger question. How much does any of this actually matter? After all, a delayed flight isn't the end of the world. An internet outage for a few hours, nobody's going to lose too much sleep over that. A fuel queue isn't, that's not going to stop people doing things. A motorcycle restriction isn't the end of the world. And individually, that's absolutely true. But that's not really the point. The point is that at the start of this war, most Russians were able to view it as something happening elsewhere. The fighting was taking place in Ukraine. The missile strikes were all happening over in Ukraine. The destruction was all happening in Ukraine. For many ordinary Russians, life continued largely unchanged. People went to work, they went shopping, they went on holiday, they filled up their vehicles, they caught flights, they used their phone to do their banking. The war was something that they watched on television, on the news. It was happening hundreds or thousands of miles away. Today, that situation is changing. There are now regions where people regularly experience internet disruptions for long periods. There are regions in Russia where fuel shortages are becoming a daily problem. There are regions where airports are frequently affected by drone alerts, and there are areas where air defense activity has become a normal part of daily life. And the authorities now banning motorcycles in Crimea means that they're worried about confusion with drone attacks, and individually, none of these developments are transformational, unless you've got a motorbike and you want to go out at night in Crimea. Collectively, however, they create something different. They create uncertainty for the people. People don't know whether their flight will leave on time. They don't know whether the mobile internet will be available tomorrow. They've got no idea whether a drone alert will affect local infrastructure or close some of the roads. And whilst these concerns are obviously nowhere near the scale of what Ukraine has endured through the whole of this war, they nevertheless represent an important shift, because confidence matters. Morale is important. Predictability is something that we're all looking for. One of the objectives of any government during wartime is to reassure its population that everything remains under control, that life can continue as normal, your daily routine will be unaffected. The challenge Russia increasingly faces is that Ukraine's drone campaign is making it much harder to get that message across, not because drones are destroying entire cities or that society is collapsing in Russia, but because they're creating a growing number of interruptions to everyday life. Thousands of small disruptions that accumulate over time, and eventually those disruptions begin to affect the way people think, the way people feel, and the way they view the future. We've spent a lot of time in this channel discussing the financial cost of this war, the impact of the sanctions, the pressure on government finances, labour shortages in Russia, supply chain problems, military spending basically being a massive part of the government budget. All of those issues remain important, but what we're now starting to see is something very different. We're starting to see the impact on ordinary daily life for Russians, the impact on convenience, the impact on confidence and morale. Because for the first few years of this conflict, many Russians experienced the war as simply a news story in the same way as you may do. Increasingly, some are starting to experience it as part of everyday life. And that's why I think this motorcycle story is so interesting. On the surface, it almost sounded comical. A government restricting motorbikes because they don't like the sound of drones and that motorbikes are too similar to it. But underneath that story sits a much bigger reality. The reality where air defences are on alert, where infrastructure requires protection, where transport networks are being disrupted, where fuel supplies are under pressure, and where the effects of a war that once felt distant for many Russians are becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The reason that I've called this video The Sound of Fear isn't really because of motorbikes. It's because the constant uncertainty is gradually becoming part of life in some parts of Russia. Nobody knows where the next drone will appear, nobody knows what facility will be targeted, or which airport might be closed, or which internet service will go down, and the uncertainty is creating consequences that extend far beyond the battlefield. So hopefully you found today's video useful, informative, and most importantly thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Thank you to everybody that's supporting me. If you bought me a coffee or sent me a YouTube super thanks or signed up as a patron or a member, thank you so much for that support. I really do appreciate it.